And we're going. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Larry Edwards, your chair for ASQ Government Division. I'd like to welcome you into the new year. I know a great deal of us have not been able to connect thus far in the year, but we didn't get past February before we're making this happen. And today, I'm pleased to introduce our distinguished speaker. This is our first webinar of 2022, and today our presenter is none other than Dr. Stephen Kull. And Dr. Stephen Kull is a political psychologist and director of programs for public consultation with the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, who's been studying public opinion, and that's important to know what we think, on public policy, even there, that much more, for nearly about 3 decades. Dr. Kull has also founded and serves as the president of Voice of the People. And Voice of the People is a nonpartisan organization seeking to give the public greater voice in government decision-making. What a novel idea. He has worked extensively with officials in our U.S. Congress, in the executive branch, and in the United Nations to develop surveys that help policymakers gain greater insight into public values and beliefs on policy. So today, our presentation is titled Consulting the People, Finding Common Ground. We definitely could use that. And this is new online methods for consultation. So our event today, we have, in our summary, we talk about Americans today are expressing high levels of dissatisfaction with their government. I don't think that's new to any of us, but it is rising. Research shows that this is rooted in frustration that the government officials pay little attention to the views of the people while they're responding to the various competing interests, often leading to polarization and gridlock. And I know that's been growing more and more over the last 20 years or better. So join us in the webinar with University of Maryland professor and the director of public programs for public consultation, Dr. Stephen Kull, on new methods for using the internet to consult large representative samples of citizens and on pressing issues. And now, all right, so as stated before, today's webinar is brought to you by the American Society of Quality. Just in case you didn't know where you were, ASQ for short, and the ASQ Government Division. And now, there we go. Oh, we go back one, please. Oh, okay, well, here we go, we're good. Okay. So a little bit about the ASQ Government Division. ASQ Government Division represents the voice of quality throughout the world. Well, ASQ represents we're not as big, not Government Division, we are part of ASQ, but ASQ represents the voice of quality throughout the world, has over 80,000 members. Now, as far as ASQ Government, we are one division of 26 total divisions in the society, and we represent ASQ Government Division is a community of practitioners that are focused on quality and performance improvement at all levels of government. That includes federal, state, local, and international government. We are composed of government leaders and employees, seasoned experts, consultants, practitioners, university professors, students, and others engaged with an interest in the public sector. So anyone who has an interest in public sector, whether you serve in it directly, whether you don't serve in it at all, you're just connected and you want to see government performance better, please come join our community. Next. All right. So we have some upcoming, we have a lot upcoming, but we have upcoming in April, we have what we have called the ANSI G1 standard, which is used by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives, and the National Center for Explosive Training Research. So the ASQ ANSI G1 standard is the standard that was released last March in consultation with ANSI and ASQ on how to address system and process maturity, and we have some people who are, some groups that are using it, and we want to get some feedback from them. So, to join that webinar, please go to our site listed here for our ASQ Government Division to learn more about it and to register, and there's going to be some more webinars coming really, really soon. All right, oh, yes, there we go. Okay, so in order to make sure that we cover any questions that you have, we're asking at the bottom, it should probably be on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen if you're on a laptop. There's a Q&A chat box, so please send any questions that you have for Dr. Kull as he advances through the presentation in the Q&A box, and we'll make sure at the back end of the presentation that we get those addressed. And if you'd like to be a speaker or you'd like to actually join our division and find out more and really put your hands to a lot of very interesting issues on improving quality in our government, please feel free to reach out to our division officers, including myself, and that'll be on the contact information will be on the back slides at the back of the presentation. And most of our presentations are available for download within a few days. And the presentation and maybe some other information as it comes in will be available at this website on our government division below. And now I'm going to step off the stage and step back, and please give a warm welcome to our presenter, Dr. Stephen Kull.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to sharing today with you some ideas about that might improve the quality of government service in response to something that's pretty important to the American people right now. So we're going to be looking at the notion of consulting the public and answering the public's demand for greater voice, which we have found. And we have also found that when you consult the public, you actually find quite a lot of bipartisan common ground, far more than we find in Congress and probably most state houses as well. Now, this is probably not surprising to you that trust in government has really plummeted. Back in 1964, 76% that said that they can trust the government in Washington to do what is right about 76% of the time, or 76% of the public says they can they trust the government like that, and that's dropped from 76 down to 16%. 83% say only some of the time. There's been a lot of polling on this over the years. And when you ask, how do you feel about the way the government works, large majorities say that they're angry or dissatisfied. It shifts a little depending upon who's in control of the government between the parties, but even then, all around you still have large majorities who say that they're either angry or dissatisfied. Now, the work I'm going to be sharing right now is the result of extensive research with over 16,000 registered voters. And what we found by doing this extensive research into why people are dissatisfied with government is that there's a perception that there's been a violation of the social contract that goes back to the founders. And this social contract basically says that in exchange for the people giving elected officials the reins of power and submitting to that power and paying taxes, elected officials should serve the common good of the people rather than their own interests or any type of special interest. And they should consult and be influenced by the views of the people they represent. And if you ask them, well, imagine the founders of the American Republic were somehow able to observe how the U.S. government is operating today. In your opinion, would the founders think that the U.S. government is fulfilling the vision they had? Very well, somewhat well. Well, overwhelming majorities say not well. Why is that? Probing through open-ended questions and focus groups and all this, the key response is they're failing to serve the common good over the special interest. This is a trendline question that goes back to the 60s again that says, would you say the government is pretty much run by a few big interests looking out for themselves, or that it is run for the benefit of all the people? And back in 1964, a majority said the benefit of all. but that has been dropping over the years, and the perception that a few big interests basically run things has been on the rise. Now, the primary mechanism of this influence is seen as campaign donations, and large majorities, overwhelming majorities, say that the members of Congress put a higher priority on serving the interests of organizations and individuals who've donated money to their election rather than serving the good of the country. They're seen as overly responsive to partisan interests. Presented the critique members of Congress think mostly about their party, not what's good for the country. Overwhelming majorities agree with that, most of them strongly. And even when you put forward the idea that the competition of ideas creates a vibrant, when there's conflict between the political parties, this creates a competition of ideas that creates a vibrant system where many voices are heard, leading to decisions that best reflect the will of the people, versus the idea that parties fight for their narrow interest, the will of people is ignored, and the results do not serve the people. Overwhelming majorities choose the latter. Now, what's core in this is that they perceive that elected officials are failing to consult and be influenced by the people. Overwhelming majorities agree members of Congress do not listen to the people they represent, that they do not do what the majority of the people would do. And when they are asked, how responsive do you think members of Congress should be to the views of the majority of their constituents on a scale of 0 to 10, the mean response is 8.4. Asked, how responsive are they? The mean response is just 3.7. 88% say the public should have more influence, and there's just minor differences between the parties on this. This is also highly related to voting behavior. When people perceive a candidate, in this case a Senate candidate, as being responsive, they're likely to vote for them. When they perceive them as not very responsive or being somewhat responsive, they're much less likely to vote for them. There's also optimism that greater responsiveness to the people have positive effects, that it will reveal common ground. If the views of the public were to have more influence on government decision makers, would the nation be better off or worse off? Overwhelmingly better off. And do you think they'd be more or less likely to find common ground? Overwhelmingly more likely. And as we will soon find out, they're actually right. Even though we put forward the argument, if Congress would listen to the people, this would help break the logjam because the people are less polarized than Congress versus the views. Turning the views of the people would not help because the gridlock in Congress is just a reflection of the polarization among the people. It does a little better, but you still have overwhelming majorities saying the problem is polarization in Congress. And do they think there's an adequate system for hearing the voice of the people? Overwhelmingly not an adequate system. So we're going to look at a new system for consulting the people, online public consultation surveys. So the idea is this gives the public the means to better understand and weigh in. It's an important part of it, to give the public a means to better understand and weigh in on public policy making decisions, and brings the public to the table when policy decisions are being made. It addresses the dissatisfaction with government, helps fulfill the democratic social contract, to consult the people. It creates a counterforce to the special interests and donors and so on. And it legitimates government decisions to the extent that the government is perceived as consulting the people in the process of coming to decisions. We also have found that it helps reveal common ground. And this gives policymakers cover to be more flexible, to not be so partisan. Thus, it offers a kind of path through gridlock. We have found, doing this research, over 170 common ground positions. Those are positions that are supported by both Republicans and Democrats on national issues on a whole range of areas. And this is all online if you want to go see it. So why doesn't Congress know there's this common ground? Well, we've done a lot of interviews with members of Congress and staffers and so on, and executive branch officials, and they get their sense of the public through all the forces that are coming at them. And many of those forces are actually organized interests, lobbyists, donors, and some self-selected constituents. But for all the pressures coming on at them, they get this impression about what the public is really thinking. Now, they look at standard polls some, but they're really not adequate. Very few deal with policy issues. because the public just doesn't have enough information to deal with many of these policy issues, and sometimes they have misinformation. They have very wrong ideas. We did a survey where in the 90s where we asked people said they were spending too much on foreign aid, and we said, well, how much do you think we're spending as a percentage of the budget? And they said 20% of the budget. And we said, well, how much do you think it should be? And they said, oh, how about 10? And when in fact it was 1. And we said, well, how would you feel if it were 1? And hardly anybody thought that was too much. So it is really key that they have the correct information, and it's valid for members of Congress to look at standard polls with some, with a jaundiced eye, because maybe the public doesn't have correct information. Also, a standard response is, well, they haven't heard my killer argument, and if they heard my killer argument, it would all be different. I could persuade them. And finally, when you bring national data to members of Congress, they say, well, that's not my district. So they really need to hear from their constituents. So now there is a field of public consultation, such as citizen juries, citizen councils, things like that. And the problem with them is that, and they're great. I'm all for it. It's a good thing to do. But there are some limits. They generally have quite small samples. They lack transparency. You go in a room, things happen, people come out, and who knows what happens in there. And there's no role for non-participants. There's been a lot of complaints about this, particularly in Europe. And finally, and probably most importantly, they're very expensive and it's very difficult to scale. So we have been developing a method that uses the internet and has this great capacity to scale. And what we do is we take people through an online process called a policy-making simulation. The idea is to put the respondent in the shoes of a policymaker. So they get a briefing on an issue, they are presented the policy proposals that are being considered, they are presented and evaluate arguments pro and con, and finally they make their recommendations to policymakers. There are other variations that we're going to explore later too, but this is sort of the core model. The advantages here is that you can do large samples so that you get a real, meaningful margin of error. Everything is completely transparent. There is a role for non-participants because we take these policy-making simulations, we put them online, and anybody can go through the process and in the end send their recommendations to their members of Congress or the executive branch or whoever. So there is a role for them. And these simulations can be used in schools, with civic groups, and so on. So it becomes a real kind of open system. And the cost is far lower. It's really quite modest, so it's truly scalable. And when we've polled on it, described it, overwhelming majority say that they approve of members of Congress using these kinds of surveys, and they think 2/3 think that they're likely to be more responsive as a result. Not quite as big as the 90% approval, but they're still optimistic. So I'm going to give you a little quick course on designing a public consultation survey. So the first thing to do is, and I'm going to be focused on kind of the simplest form, which is there's a single proposal. And there's a provision in a bill that's coming up. So the first thing is to identify the choice point. This could be the decision in a piece of legislation, or it could be an executive branch decision, and it's pretty straightforward. Do you favor or oppose taking this action, raising the minimum wage, or what it might be? But it's always very clear that it's essential to get the choice point fully identified. Then you develop a briefing. Now, this, you think, oh God, it's so complicated. How can these people understand this? How can you get this across to them? And if you work with it, it's surprising that you can do it. The key thing is, or the few key things are, what is the core value or priority debate going on here? What is the essential issue? And try to get at the core of it. There's a sort of core tension, core debate, and bring that to the surface immediately. Then, what's the minimum amount of information they need to understand this debate? Don't just transmit information wholesale. And others, they feel they're doing homework. You know, it's just like, here, you ought to know all this stuff. Boom, absorb this. It has to be linked to the debate. It has to be understood as a way of getting a better understanding of the issue that matters to them, and then they'll pay attention. So you create this tension, you provide the information that's experienced as relevant for resolving the tension. Then you go develop the pro and con arguments. And the idea here is you're trying to simulate a floor debate in Congress or wherever, you know, in the state house, wherever, or in a county or a city council. So and then you need to do the research. What are advocates for each position saying? Got to make sure that you're getting the best arguments. So usually when there's a single question, you have all key arguments. If it's something you're going to do that's very short, you might just have one pro and one con, and all the key arguments are put together in one little short speech. If it's more complex and you have more space and time and want to develop it more, you'll have multiple pros and cons, each with a theme. You can also use a format where there's a kind of dialogue, where there's a pro is presented and then the con is presented in a way that responds to the pro, and it goes back and forth, kind of like a debate, you know, an argument, rebuttal, that kind of thing. Then, before making the final recommendation, we usually have people do an assessment of the proposal on a 0 to 10 scale, where 0 is completely unacceptable, 5 is just tolerable, and 10 is completely acceptable. Now, this is really important because it's not just do you favor or oppose. You know, how are you going to feel if it happens, right? So people might say, well, I oppose it in principle, but I can tolerate it. And so that number, how many people say it's tolerable? You want to know how many people say it's more than tolerable, but you also want to know how many people say it's tolerable. That's very important to know when you're dealing with the politics of a population. And then in the end, you do ask for their final recommendation. And as a basic favor oppose, sometimes we present as, what would you recommend? How would you recommend your representative vote? Now, in this case, we don't usually use, you strongly favor, strongly oppose. We try to keep it very simple, because in the end, it is a yay or nay. And so we are trying to, again, put the respondent in the shoes of the policymaker, where they really just have to make the choice, and they can't kind of waffle. They got to go one way or the other. Now, when you're doing a simulation with multiple options, where you're not just saying, you know, the choices between multiple possibilities, so there are different ways you can do it. You can do a pro and con argument for each option, or you can just do pros for each option, depending upon how much time and space you have, how much priority you want to put on this particular issue. Remember, you're going to do a whole series of choice points in one survey, usually. Our surveys generally take about a half an hour, and people will do anywhere from 5 to 12 policy questions. Now, after you do the pros and cons for each option, then you assess each one separately. So, well, if this were to happen, how would you feel on the 0 to 10 scale? If this were to happen, how would you feel on the 0 to 10 scale? And that provides very important information. Now, in the end, you say, okay, what's your preferred option? But just getting the preferred option is not enough. Doesn't give you everything you need to know, because maybe they thought all of them were fine and this was just the best one, or maybe they thought all of them were pretty poor and this one is just kind of okay, you know. And that's all important information to have, and that often doesn't come through if you just said, you know, if you just ask in the end, do you favor or oppose? Now, developing the policy-making simulation does require, and this is very important, an outside review. So you get advocates on both sides, if possible, people in government, somebody who's, you can go directly to the sponsors of legislation, or you can go to advocates who are outside organizations or academics who write about it, and you present them all of the content of the simulation, and you say, okay, look at the briefing. Is it accurate and balanced? Does it include everything that's needed? Is there something missing here? And then you say, okay, now look at the arguments. Are these the strongest ones being made? And look at the arguments on the other side. Do you think anything's false or misleading? Now, you might think, oh gosh, today people can't agree on anything. And how are they going to come to a consensus on these questions? And surprisingly, they do. And we've had them all at the table together, and that's about a good presentation of the issue. Yeah, those are good arguments. They sometimes even say, they even give each other tips on their arguments of the other side. What's key is that they can't make any, statements that are perceived as false or misleading. So again, the guiding principles is to mirror the policy discourse and to simulate the experience of a policymaker. Getting briefed, hearing speeches on the floor of Congress or in the city council or whatever, and then ultimately making their decision. So that is sort of the core model. Now I'm going to present you some more elaborate ideas of things that can be done that take it a bit further, where you're actually going into a kind of interactive problem solving. And and I'm going to focus on Social Security because that's obviously a very big issue. And also there are so many states now there are real problems with retirement programs. So we, in this process, we give people an initial briefing on the program, the amount of benefits, progressivity of benefits, and then a briefing on the shortfall. Just to give you an example of the kinds of things that we show. Here's the ratio of active workers for each Social Security retiree over time, how that's going down, how the Americans are living longer, how the projected population of elderly people is going up and is projected to go quite a lot higher, and that if no action is taken, then there will be this substantial reduction in the Social Security benefits. And we don't say it must be done, it must be changed. No, maybe that's okay with you to see the benefits going down. So we present them a series of options for changes to Social Security. 4 of them deal with covering the shortfall, but 2 of them also deal with possible benefit increases, because that's very much being considered, an increase in the minimum benefit, increase benefits for the very old. So we then go through the pro and con for each option. The first one is about reducing benefits. Just to give you an example, Social Security was established with the express purpose of ensuring that older disabled people, Americans, would not fall into poverty. It really makes no sense that people with higher incomes even get higher benefits than people with lesser incomes. So the proposal, as I just showed, is to reduce the benefits of people with higher income. And this is the argument in favor of it. And as you can see, the majority find the argument convincing. Now, something you're going to see that might surprise you is that it's really common that both the pro and the con are found convincing by a majority of the people. Now, you think, oh, gosh, what's the matter with them? Are they disorganized in their brain? Well, we think this is actually a positive indication. It means that people are deliberating. They're thinking, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point too. So how they respond to the arguments does not always predict how they're going to the choice they're going to make in the end. Okay, so here's the other side. American workers have been paying Social Security payroll taxes for all their working lives on the promise that they would be getting this money back in the form of benefits. Reducing expected benefits to people who make more money is a violation of this understanding and changes Social Security from a retirement program into a welfare program. Okay, here again, large majorities find that convincing. By the way, you can see how it came out in specific states. as you can see, there's really very little difference between the blue states and the red states. This is something that we find rather regularly. So interestingly, on the con side here, the con argument actually does slightly better than the pro argument. But when in the end well, I'll come back to that. But, no, I'll explain to you now. At the end, they are presented a spreadsheet with all of the options, and then they finally make their choices about what they're going to do. And there's a little bubble that follows them and tells them how they're doing relative to the shortfall, how the choices they're making impact the shortfall. And in the end, large majority favored reducing benefits for at least the upper 25% of earners. We also explored what about the upper 40%, and then that drops off. That only 31% favor that. And then I looked for 50%, it was even less. So another option is raising the retirement age. So argument, people at 66 are now much healthier than in the past, and most of the work people do is much less physically demanding, so it's appropriate for people who work a little bit longer before retiring. Raising the retirement age is a common, was running out of juice. Raising the retirement age is a common sense response to how life has changed in the modern era. Large majorities find that convincing. Republicans, Democrats, independents, all the different states. On the other side, raising the retirement age is unfair because many workers in their 60s still hold physically demanding jobs, blue-collar jobs or retailer jobs where they are on their feet all day. For them, it's already a stretch for their retirement age to rise to 67 as planned. It should not rise any further. And again, large majorities find this one convincing as well. But in the end, when they're faced with a problem, large majorities say, okay, let's raise it to 68. Again, it's like they're ambivalent, but here's the problem of the Social Security shortfall, and they could see the benefits go down, and in that context, they say, okay, let's raise it to 68, but most don't want to go all the way to 69. Now, another big one is eliminating the cap on income subject to the payroll tax. And the argument in favor of this one is the income of the wealthy have been growing by leaps and bounds, while the incomes of the middle class have been stagnating. If we eliminate the cap, then on income subject to the payroll tax, people with higher incomes would be paid a lot more. So it's time, and the argument goes, for the wealthy to step up and do their part by helping to make Social Security secure. Besides, all it means is they pay the payroll tax all year like everybody else, not just the first part of the year. And oh wow, that gets overwhelming numbers to find it convincing. While the other side, high earners just saw their income taxes, investment taxes, and Medicare taxes increase. Higher taxes will discourage them from working and encourage tax evasion. They will also have less money to make investments that create jobs and so on. This argument does not do well. Anything that gets under 50% is not doing well. And you know, a slight majority of Republicans find it convincing, but overall it does not do well. And 59% favor eliminating the cap, and then another 30-something percent favored raising the cap substantially. I'm not going to go through all the details of the arguments, but raising the payroll tax rate is another proposal, and here's the argument in favor of that gets again, large majorities. Argument against, again, large majorities. Remember, people are ambivalent. That's a really important thing to understand, and it's not a bad thing. It means they're thinking. In the end, they raised it from 6.2 to 6.6, but not from all the way to 6.7. Now, there was also a proposal for raising the monthly benefit for those who worked 30 years or more, and a majority overall, but only half of Republicans supported that. I'm going a little faster now. I'm not showing you all the pros and cons. And we also looked at supplementing benefits for those 85 and over. And even though the arguments in favor did really well, less than half favored that. Again, they're interacting with that that bubble that tells them how they're doing relative to the shortfall. So here in the end, you basically have larger majorities favoring reducing benefits for the upper 25%, raising the retirement age to 68, raising the cap on taxable earnings to $215,000, and even more, to raising it, eliminating it, or pardon me, a smaller number, but still a majority eliminating it, and then raising the payroll tax rate. And all these steps cover 66% of the shortfall. This is true in all of the states as well. They're eliminating the cap also gets a majority, and not as big as for the raising the cap, and raising the minimum monthly benefit also gets a majority, and adding these into the mix, you cover 98% of the shortfall because eliminating the cap has a big impact. So remember that they go through each one separately, and they evaluate each argument separately, and then in the end it's put together like a big spreadsheet, and they make their decisions, make their choices, and there's this interactive process where they're dealing with the bubble that tells them how they're doing. Now, this is really interesting. Differences by affected subpopulations. Now, you might think when it comes to the retirement age, people under 50 who would be affected by it would have a different attitude than people over 50 who would not be affected by it. And as you can see, there is very little difference. People are not making choices based on how it helps them. And here's another example. Raising the cap on income subject to the payroll tax to $215,000 or eliminating it. People with incomes over $100,000, oh, that'll impact them. That'll have a big, you think, oh, well, I don't want to do that. While people less than $100,000, they would, be more in favor. Well, again, there's virtually no difference between people with high incomes and low incomes. So a little bit of difference in some cases, but hardly. So one last thing I want to cover, and I'll try to. I mean, to kind of move along on this, and I wanted to share this because I can imagine this that might be of interest to people in a lot of situations where they're dealing with a budget and where there are deficits and there are trade-offs, and in a way you kind of bring all kinds of aspects together into the budget. The budget is so multi-dimensional, and if you look at standard polls. Just in regard to the federal budget, you say, do you want to reduce the deficit? Oh, yeah, majority, yeah, do, yeah. Okay, separate question. Do you favor raising taxes? No, I'd rather not raise taxes. No, thank you. Do you want to cut benefits? Do you want to cut spending in this area, the education, Social Security, the environment, no, I'd rather not. No, I'd rather not. And then people throw up their arms and they go, the public is just a big baby. They don't understand. They don't understand that you think money grows on trees. What's the matter with them? And and you have the same problem with Social Security. They want to reduce the shortfall. They don't want to reduce benefits, and they don't want to raise taxes. And that's the problem with one of the problems with standard polls. But what we do in this situation is we put them in the shoes of the policymaker, and we create this interactive process where they're getting all of the information at once, and they make their decisions in that context. So now, but we also get them ready to think about it. So they go through pros and cons, and around some of the big questions that are in play, and right now in the U.S. around the federal deficit or budget, the big question is it important to reduce the deficit? Some people think it's not. Is it important to reduce the size of government? Some people think it is. Some people think it's not. Is it important to make public investments for the government to invest in efforts that will have long-term benefits? So we have them go through a whole series of pros and cons on those issues. We also give them background information about the amount of the deficit, how it's gone up and down over the years, and then we also explain how the debt is growing. People get those things confused, the deficit and the debt, and we have language that makes all this clear. We also share with them what's going on with the size of government and how it's gone up and down. There's a slight upward trend, but it's actually fairly stable. Then we bring them the discretionary budget, and we break that into 31 line items. We don't deal with entitlements. This is just the discretionary budget. 31 line items, and we show recent and proposed levels of spending, and there's a bubble there that shows the projected deficit. Here's an example of transportation, air travel and roads, shows what highways, mass transit, a description of what happens in each one, amount that was in 2017, how amount was in 2018, and then what's budgeted, and then finally what's your recommendation, and then they can put that in the box. And as soon as they put that number in, the little bubble changes, up or down depending upon their recommendation. So then we do this with a whole. That was just a little example, and they go through all of them. Then we go through the revenue questions, whether to reduce tax, and they do the pros and cons on whether or not it's important to reduce taxes, whether or not it's important to increase taxes on high incomes, whether or not to have taxes that discourage certain behaviors like alcohol taxes, green taxes, so on, taxes that discourage pollution, things like that. And again, pros and cons. Then they deal with are presented income tax rates, and they have the capacity to set the income tax rates at different income brackets. And here's just an example for the 75 to 100,000 one. Now, you go to the middle there, that shaded part, you can keep the current rate. Now, this is really important. When you think, oh God, income taxes, they're just so complicated. There are these different rates, there are deductions, it's just overwhelming. So what we use is effective income tax rates, which is the rate that people in that income bracket ultimately pay as a percentage of their income. It's not the marginal rate, and which is much higher, which is just on the last dollars. So basically all the information gets crunched down into the effective tax rate. And for the 75 to 100,000 at this time, it was 13.4%. Now, this is after the tax cuts under Trump, and previously they had been 14.7. Now, so you have the option to go back to where it was before, and that buys you $20 billion. But you can go even higher to 15.7, that buys you 35, or you can go up to 16.7, that buys you 50. Or you can reduce it down to 15 or 30, and you can reduce it down to 12.4 or 11.4, but that costs you in terms of the deficit and little activity in that bubble. So here are the other sources of revenue that we explored: modifying existing taxes, corporate tax rate, capital gains and dividends, the estate tax, alcohol tax. Some of these required explanations, little bar graphs, things like that to explain how they work. And then options for new taxes: a surtax on high incomes, fees on highly leveraged banks, a financial transaction fee, a little tiny bit for each stock sale, that kind of thing. And then taxes to discourage behaviors like a greenhouse gas tax or a sugary drinks tax, and so on. And which is really, now it's really quite interesting. Going back to people are incoherent, they don't want to reduce spending, they don't want to increase taxes, but they want to reduce the deficit. Well, they actually do pretty well. Overall, in terms of the overall sample, the majority did cut spending $70 billion, and they increased revenues $474 billion. For a total deficit reduction of $544 billion. Now, what's really interesting, if you just ask them in a poll question, to deal with the deficit, would you rather see reductions in spending or increases in taxes? They divide and kind of lean toward, let's reduce spending more. But when they actually get in front of the areas of possible reductions, the actual line items, they don't cut it as much. They cut some, especially subsidies to big agricultural companies gets cut, and the defense budget usually gets cut. So there was substantial difference between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans cut a little less because they didn't want to cut defense mostly. They didn't increase revenues quite as much. So but they reduced the deficit $401 billion. Democrats did more of both. It got to $663 billion. But what's really important, where is the bipartisan convergence? And there was $376 billion of convergence, what the majority of Republicans and Democrats wanted to do. So another form that we've been using is in specific states and districts, we are now doing what are called public consultation forums. And what we do is we find a member of Congress who wants to do this. We then partner with local media, and then we do a survey using a policymaking simulation in their district or state. So far, it's all been districts. And then we convene a forum where the member of Congress comes and the constituents, some constituents who took the survey come, and the results are presented one at a time. And then there's a discussion, and people say more about why they answered that way, and the member comments, and there's the discussion. What's amazing about it is people, because they've seen all the nuances, they're not, there's nothing strident. There's the whole nature of the discussion is very civil. People don't get up and shake their finger or anything like that. So the members will love it because they hate, going to town halls and having people yell at them about this solution is so obvious and so on. And so having a kind of thoughtful discussion is something that they really enjoy. Here's an example.
I thought it was a great experience. First, because I got to see the data on the survey, both nationally and more importantly to my district. But then it was really the conversation with people who had looked at the data, considered sort of the nuance of these tough policy issues, and were able to engage in a really thoughtful, civil conversation.
I like that you're bringing different cross-sections together from the community to talk about an issue that has to be bipartisan if it's gonna survive both chambers of Congress.
This to me is what Congress should be when you think about it, a microcosm of the whole country where people get together, take serious ideas seriously, have a debate, a discussion, people are learning things, taking in new information, and then we're trying to arrive at the best solutions possible. So this is a great model.
And this intends to produce a lot of really good press. Here's Jamie Raskin on the front of the local paper saying Raskin reaches out to residents. So it gets good coverage, and members really tend to like it because they're reporting on the fact that this is happening as the public is being consulted as well as the results of the survey. So just quickly, is it politically viable for members to play this role? Could a candidate run on committing to consult a citizen panel? Are there political risks? Basically, I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. We have found that not only people are very positive. They say that it would make them more likely to vote for a candidate. And Democrats have a positive view of Republicans, Republicans having a positive view of Democrats. Now, we went it further and had them imagine that there was like a debate, and there was an attack on the candidate who took this, who would commit to this public consultation. Members of Congress, and the attack was members of Congress shouldn't govern by putting their finger to the wind, reacting to every shift in public opinion. The American people elect members of Congress to show leadership and make decisions, and so on. And this does really poorly. Less than half find it convincing. While the opposite argument, the problem with Congress is not that they're too reactive to public opinion, it's they're too reactive to special interests. This whole method will give us advice from people and so on, and that gets overwhelming majority saying that they would find it convincing. And when we ask, okay, based on what you've heard, who would you be more inclined to vote for? Then and we had it broken out, imagine a Republican candidate, imagine a Democratic candidate, and overwhelming majority said that they would vote for that candidate, and Democrats said that they would vote for a Republican, and Republicans said that they would vote for a Democrat who would make these commitments to consult this public. All right, I'm going to stop there and open it up for Q&A. A few minutes long. let's see here. So I'm going to pass it back to Larry.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kull. Actually, we're going to pass it over to Ina. Ina is going to manage the Q&A for the questions, and then I will come back to take us home. Ina.
Yes, so the first question is racial and ethnic equity considered working for a special interest?
Oh, no, I would not say that. I mean, these are people, and they're they are constituents, and something we do is we do break out the positions of subgroups as well, including racial subgroups, ethnic subgroups, income brackets, all that. So all that information is delivered. And for the 170 positions I mentioned that were common ground positions, virtually all of them are supported by different racial groups as well. So no, this is we see this method as a means of giving subgroups voice as well as the public overall. I'm really glad you brought that up because that's a really important point. I've been highlighting more the partisan breakouts, but the other groups, it gives them voice, and we also deal with a lot of issues that are specifically related to race issues that are particularly prominent for certain racial groups related to sentencing reform and the use of criminal records and police reform and so on.
Thank you. The second question is there a risk with this model that the consensus of local constituents or output of policy-making simulations may be self-serving and not be in the best interest of the country?
Well, that's, I mean, the essence of a democracy is who's going to make that judgment about what serves the best interest of the country. And while ultimately elected officials make those decisions, what's key is that they should consult the people in that process. So ultimately, yeah, the policymaker has to make that decision. Now, the question is, does the public think in terms of the common good, or are they just a bunch of people looking out for their self-interest? And then, you know, we can cobble together some majority. Well, as I showed you on the Social Security one, this all came up in the budget exercise. You would think that people, when they are setting the income tax rates, that they would favor their own income bracket, right? You know, but they don't. In fact, what's really interesting, people with higher incomes are softer on people with low income than people in the low income brackets. So people do, and this has been extensively studied, that when you ask people to think about public policy issues, they don't keep their self-interest hat on. They put on the policymaker hat, and they really do ask what's good for the larger whole. And that's less true of Congress, because Congress is driven around by their donors and the special interests that essentially sponsored them, and that's when you have more of the conflict. That's the essential idea of this whole process, of this whole effort, is that when you ask the average citizens who don't have donors and lobbyists at their door, they think about the common good more than members of Congress, and they find common ground because it becomes kind of self-evident what does serve the common good.
Thank you. The next question is, of the 170 policy position simulations, which one do you recall being the most popular? And there's a second part, which one has been the most transformative for participants?
The transformative of the participants, did you say?
Yes, has been the most transformative for participants. Yes.
Gosh, I'm not sure how to answer that. I can't answer. I don't have the answer to the question of what the highest was on the 170. But what I can tell you is that when we do pros and cons, usually you have a majority finding the pro and the con convincing, right? But where that has not ever happened is about this question of whether or not members should use these methods to consult their constituents. We always get overwhelming majorities finding that the pro arguments convincing, and we have never found any con argument with a majority, even close to a majority, finding them convincing. So that is where you have an extraordinary amount of overwhelming bipartisan consensus. You also have quite a lot of consensus on a lot of government reform proposals, like reducing the effects of like campaign finance reform. Those get overwhelming. The transformation, I mean, there are things that like as I mentioned, you've got foreign aid. Majority think we're spending too much on foreign aid, but then when they see how much we're actually spending, then you don't have very many people. You don't have a majority cutting foreign aid. So that's one example. I guess that and I would say that overall, people, when they're in a context where they're dealing with the trade-offs, they do things that you wouldn't predict. They raise taxes more than you might predict, particularly when it's a Republican. Or you have Democrats who raise the retirement age or limit some benefits. So in those kinds of contexts, people act in a way that is a bit out of character from given their partisan affiliation.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Kull. I will pass it on to Larry for closing. We have a few questions that we didn't get. Those questions will be answered via email, the email that will be sent with the recording. Thank you very much. Larry?
Fantastic. Thank you, Ina. Thank you, Dr. Kull. We really, yeah, there are other questions that folks have, but we want to be respectful of time, and we really want to take our hats off to the work that you have done. And honestly, there's been some even though it wasn't questions, there's comments from some of our GDLC members wanting to be able to reach out to you and maybe be able to do some good work for the public together. So we've got your information on the slide here. So for all, if you're okay with that, Dr. Kull, all right, fantastic. So we really appreciate this presentation. Maybe we can do some more about that, and maybe we can even feature some of this material at the WCQI or the ASQ World Conference here coming up in May. So we really appreciate everyone coming out. We look forward to doing more webinars along different things, but even maybe revisiting some of these sort of things, whether it be in webinar form or in work groups. So at that, I bid you adieu, a great day, and look forward to seeing you soon. Bye, everyone.
Thanks for having me.